Hi, my name is Jen, and I'm the director of the Refuge here at Riverwood. I want to take a few minutes to talk about the 8 strategies that Pastor Todd has been teaching on. Number 1, make a weekly appointment with your churchies. Find some time during the week to connect with your churchies. If you've never been to one of our services, there are some other ways that you can connect. Number 2, refuse to have a puny faith. Instead, supersize it. Having faith isn't always easy, especially in challenging times. But faith is what helps us to get through the challenging times. It gives us strength in times of weakness and points us to our Creator. When we connect with each other, it supersizes our faith. Engage in a missional endeavor. There are many ways that we can make a difference in the lives of others. One practical way that you can help is by getting involved in Riverwood's Socks and Groceries initiative. For $25, you'll provide socks for someone who's experiencing homelessness, as well as provide groceries for someone right here in our Elmwood community. Number 4, form a COVID platoon. Forming a group that you can connect with on a regular basis is not only good for your spiritual health, but for your mental health as well. God created us to be in connection with one another. Number 5, train with the Daily Yarn Challenge. If you follow Riverwood on Instagram or Facebook, you'll see daily challenges posted. These challenges are practical ways we can live out our faith as well as continue to remain connected with each other. Number 6, join a Riverwood Facebook group. There are 3 different groups for each worship community. It's simple to join. Just go to Facebook, search for Riverwood, and under the More section, select Groups and join one of the 3 groups listed. Number 7, the yarn is strong when appreciation is understood and maximized. Take a moment to think about those in your life who you appreciate. Now go tell them. You have no idea the impact that you will make in their life by simply telling them they're appreciated. Number 8, the yarn is strong when we hear, believe, and feel another's story. I'm a firm believer that connections are formed when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with one another. I've witnessed deep connections form through our support groups, where women are courageous enough to share their experiences, and through common ground and empathetic understanding, deep connections of support are created. One thing that I've been working on over the past while is to make the assumption that people are doing the very best they can. When I think this way, I'm able to step back and put myself in another person's shoes. I'm more understanding, empathetic, and this allows me to live out my faith in Christ by loving others, even those who are sometimes hard to love. And now Pastor Todd is going to share the last 2 ways that we can stay connected.
Well, I hope you have your coffee or tea or hot chocolate, a cozy blanket, and you're ready for a story. Our story begins on a cold and blustery January day in 1955 in a small town in northern Hungary. The little girl born that day was Catalin Carrico, a name you have probably never heard. Well, Catalin grew up, she finished high school, and she began university studies in Hungary. She had a very keen interest in science and chemistry and biology, and when she finished her PhD, she became a professor, but a professor with some rather outlandish and eccentric ideas. Dr. Carrico believed that it was possible for tiny molecules to be put into a person's body, and that these molecules could contain a set of instructions for the body itself to build certain kinds of proteins. Up until just a few years ago, if you wanted to fight a disease like flu or polio or measles, you needed to inject someone with the disease itself to trick the body into creating antibodies. However, Dr. Carrico believed it was possible to send a harmless bunch of molecules into the body as messengers, and that their job was to hand over a set of instructions for the body to produce antibodies without ever subjecting the person to the disease. And everyone thought she was crazy. In 1985, she was fired from the Biological Research Center where she was working at in Hungary, and this was a really tough blow. She began wondering if her ideas might actually be impossible. But she decided to press on, and risking embarrassment and humiliation, she applied for a professorship at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. Her tenure at the university started out with high hopes. With confidence and excitement, now at a new university that believed in her, she sat down and filled out the application for a lucrative research grant. A few months later, when the reply came in the mail, she couldn't wait to open it. But when she did, she read those words, "Application denied." Not about to be deterred, she risked her reputation and future, made herself vulnerable again, and applied for another grant. Application denied. Every year, she would apply for research grants to keep her work and the university moving ahead. And every time she opened the letter, it was another rejection. After 10 years of this, the university finally became frustrated that she wasn't attracting financial backing. They had had enough, and they demoted her. Well, that was 25 years ago. So what has Dr. Carrico been doing in the last 25 years? Well, she's been refining her theory, improving her techniques, putting herself out there and trying to prove that not only could this work, but it could be the answer to creating vaccines that are safer, quicker, cheaper, and save more lives. Well, in 2004, Dr. Carrico solved one of the biggest challenges that her messenger RNA experiment had been tripping over, and she published a paper reporting that she had made a breakthrough. Fast forward to 2020, and along comes COVID-19, and humanity is caught in the grips of a worldwide pandemic. Traditional vaccine techniques aren't working and would take forever to develop and test and produce. And someone says, hey, what if we use Dr. Carrico's messenger RNA technique? The very idea that countless governments, funding organizations, companies, universities, and other colleagues had rejected. And today, the idea Katalin Carrico from Hungary had dreamt up 40 years ago, that had been pushed back on and rejected for 40 years, is about to be used to quite literally save the world. And I wanted to tell you Katalin's story to illustrate this point. It is within the unknown where your greatest potential lies. Not in the safe, predictable stuff that you already know, but in the unknown. What would have happened if Katalin had been too afraid to share her idea? What would have happened if Katalin had listened to those voices in her head that said that she should just simply keep the idea to herself? What would have happened if Katalin had been more concerned about her reputation and what people thought of her and keeping up appearances as a respectable biochemist? It is within the unknown where the greatest potential lies. So what does this have to do with our relationships and connections? Well, for 4 weeks now, we've been in this series we're calling The Yarn. And we've been studying one verse, Colossians 2, verse 2, where Paul says, I want them to be encouraged and knit together by strong ties of love. I want them to have complete confidence that they understand God's mysterious plan, which is Christ himself. As Jen just reminded us, we've already explored 8 strategies for actually living out this verse. And today we're going to wrap up our series with the last 2. So here it is, number 9. The yarn is strong when we embrace uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Now, there is actually a single word for this idea, and it's this: vulnerability. The reason I told you Katalin's story is because I wanted to reframe in your mind what vulnerability is. You see, we often think of vulnerability as something to be avoided. We often equate it with weakness or exposure or bordering on feebleness and sadness and susceptibility. In fact, we regularly hear the term the vulnerable in association with those who are at risk and weakened or susceptible. The word vulnerable has come to be associated with the aged, the immune compromised, the economically challenged, those with mental health issues. It's a kind and helpful word, but in Katalin's story, we see the other side of vulnerability. We see the potential. We see how absolutely essential vulnerability is. And we see that emotional vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, growth, belonging, joy, and advancement. And quite simply put, closeness and relationship are impossible without embracing uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's impossible to have a good, healthy relationship without vulnerability. Now, I hope right about now you're asking, prove it. Show me in the Bible where this vulnerability is talked about. Actually, there are so many examples of verses that I'd like to show you, but we're going to narrow it down to just 2. And this one's a little bit longer, but stick with me as we read this out of 2 Corinthians 12, 9 to 10. Because of the extravagance of those revelations, and so I wouldn't get a big head, I was given the gift of a handicap to keep me in constant touch with my limitations. Satan's angel did his best to get me down. What he in fact did was push me to my knees. At first, I didn't think of it as a gift and begged God to remove it. 3 times I did that, and then he told me, "My grace is enough. It's all you need. My strength comes into its own in your weaknesses." Once I heard that, I quit focusing on the handicap and began appreciating the gift. It was a case of Christ's strength moving in on my weakness. Now I take limitations in stride, and with good cheer I boast of my weaknesses, abuses, accidents, opposition, bad breaks. I just let Christ take over, and so the weaker I get, the stronger I become. Wow. Talk about flipping the definition. Talk about embracing uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Talk about an example of vulnerability. But did you hear and catch what Paul said? In the uncertainty, in the risk, in the emotional exposure, in the vulnerability, the very strength of God flows into his life. If you're not used to treading around in relational uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, this is going to sound like crazy talk. If you're used to protecting your heart and your ego and your reputation and your perception of how you think other people think of you with walls and facades and other protective measures, you're going to think this is the dumbest thing you've ever heard. It's so counterintuitive. But if you have practiced the discipline of uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure, the practice of vulnerability, you know what Paul is saying is so true. Have you ever been driving down a road only to come upon a barricade? It says road closed, and then instructs you to turn right and to take a detour. So you turn right, drive a block, and you come across another barricade. Road closed, no way through. You make another turn and drive a few blocks only to come to another road closed, do not enter barricade that you need to navigate and yet find another detour. Well, that's sort of a picture of how so many of our lives are. We spot someone in our life, a friend, a sibling, even a spouse, approaching an area we really don't want them to drive through because it could be awkward or embarrassing, or they could catch a glimpse of what's really going on down those back roads. So we quickly erect a barricade and we post a road closed sign. We have no problem if they drive around and tour the nice streets that are well developed and presentable. But we're not sure what their reaction would be if they traveled down the back streets and through the alleys. And we're not about to risk it, so we block it off with a barricade. Well, erect enough barricades restricting access, and you will quickly define the kind of relationship you have. Superficial, fake, and surfacey. Listen, the people in your life aren't dumb. They can feel the hesitation and the lack of trust when you erect barricades. They quickly learn how to navigate the streets of your life, knowing what's off limits. But if you want a real, authentic, meaningful, and life-giving connection with someone, you're going to need to start taking down the barricades and allowing access to the back roads of your life that you are less certain about. Because the yarn is strong when we embrace uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So let's get super practical and ask this question. How can I become more vulnerable? How can I increase the innovation, creativity, progress, and depth of my relationships by exploring uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure? Well, number 1, remove a barricade and see what happens. In other words, experiment. Push yourself a bit. When you sense someone getting close to a barricade that you've erected to keep people out, dismantle it. And allow someone to get to know a little less polished, less charming, less together part of your life. Better yet, if you're married, don't only dismantle it, but take your spouse by the hand and take them on a bit of a tour of the stuff you struggle with, the stuff you worry about, the stuff that bothers you about yourself. You know, some of you married couples locked in your houses during this COVID lockdown are getting bored and really, to be honest, quite tired of watching TV. Well, try this. Light a candle. Set out a little board of cheese and crackers and some grapes, a favorite drink, and spend a bit of time touring your spouse around the typically barricaded parts of your life. Will that go 100% well all the time? No way. But most of the time, you'll discover relational innovations and creativity and a sense of fresh joy and closeness coming. So number one, remove a barricade and see what happens. Experiment. Number two, be curious about your own weaknesses. Some of us don't even really know or understand what's behind the barricades ourselves, and we're embarrassed by them. However, if you can take some of that negative feedback or the embarrassment of the stuff behind the barricade and get curious about it instead, and seek to understand it rather than rejecting it, well, that's just the definition of maturity. To be able to say, yeah, I feel this and this happens and I get all messed up by such and such, but I wonder why that is. That is so healthy. We all have hang-ups, we all have temptations, we all have weaknesses, and we all have stuff that gets us riled up. But to say, I wonder why that affects me like that, that is so incredibly honest and healthy. So number one, experiment, remove a barricade and see what happens. Number two, be curious about your own weaknesses. Number three, walk through the doubt and fear. If you wait for the doubt and fear to disappear before you take the barrier down, you will never get vulnerable. You know, I love the relationship that Carolyn and I have built over the last 35 years, but we both still have to practice this on a weekly basis. Just this week, on a couple of occasions, I wanted to hide behind my barrier and keep Carolyn out of an area. After a couple of days, I knew I needed to invite her in, but I also knew that it could go bad in about 13 different ways. But I know that doubt and fear will always be loitering around the barricades, trying to convince me that they are best left where they are. And I know that the presence of doubt and fear aren't a good enough reason to keep the barricade up, because doubt and fear, along with their cousin shame, are notorious liars. You need to walk through it. Move through the doubt and fear. Number four, pay close attention to the payoffs. I want you to listen to what James says in James 5, verse 16. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. Did you hear that? Speak out and talk about your uncertainties, your failures, your regrets, your mistakes, and your weaknesses. Tell one another about them and pray into those areas for one another that you may be healed. Catalan Carrico could have hidden behind barriers and refused to put her ideas out there. She could have taken all the doubt and the fear that was generated over 40 years of rejection and opposition and demotion, and she could have believed it. Instead, she kept inviting people into the imperfect world of her ideas, pushing through the doubt and fear, making herself vulnerable, and the payoff was life-altering. If you're in a relationship that needs some new life, some innovation, some refreshing, or some strengthening, be brave enough to wade into the uncertainty, risk emotional exposure, and practice the wonder of vulnerability. It quite literally is the gateway to light and life. Well, we've made it to our final yarn strategy. We've had 6 strategies for being knit together during a pandemic, and 3 what makes the yarn strong ingredients: appreciation, empathy, and vulnerability. And we're about to name and examine our 4th ingredient. However, the 4th ingredient to strong yarn relationships is in there. Oh, you don't see anything, do you? That's because your eyes are open. And so I'm going to ask to borrow your imagination, and for the next few minutes, in order for you to see it, you're going to need to close your eyes. I know, a little bit weird, but you don't want to be left on your couch sitting there just looking at me. So come on an adventure. Close your eyes, let's use our imagination, and let's go. So to get to the final ingredient that is needed to make strong relationship yarn, we're going to need to climb those great big colossal stone steps right in front of you. Since it's our imagination, instead of snow, let's make it warm. A short sleeve sort of day with the sun shining down on us. Okay, up the carved stone steps and into the grand portico lined with Roman columns that seem to touch the sky. Oh, you're wondering, what is this place? Well, you'll see soon enough. Okay, let's gather just outside those majestic oak doors because I have some instructions before we go inside. We're all going to walk in through this set of magnificent doors, but once inside, we're all going to have a different experience. Some of you will enjoy the tour and feel quite at ease and comfortable, while others of you will begin feeling agitated and nervous and quite uncomfortable. And then some of you, quite simply, won't be able to handle the experience, and you will either slip away to go grab a coffee or maybe even reach over to turn off your screen in an effort to make this place disappear. Relax, take it in, and remember that you are the only one that can see the painting and exhibits that are in front of you. All right, are you ready to step inside? Oh, hold it, a question, yes, go ahead. Right, yes. Oh, yeah, she asked a really good question. Do we need to go inside? Can't we just stay out here and enjoy the architecture from out here? Well, that's a great question. So you can stay out here. It's totally up to you. In fact, many people refuse to go inside and only stay out here, but you see, therein lies the problem. Your relationships and your life, for that matter, will remain stunted and, well, undeveloped and pretty much malfunctioning if you refuse to go inside. Okay, let's get going. Oh, hold it. Another question? All right. If this place is so important, why haven't you ever been here before? Oh, I see. Well, I'm guessing that most of you have been here before and that you're probably visiting this place many times, but you most likely came in the back door and probably after hours, often late at night. So you don't recognize it from this angle. All right, you can ask more questions once we get inside. Watch your step through the big doors, and once inside, allow your eyes to adjust to the dimmer light. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hurt Museum. This is a place where each of you has a private exhibit that you curate and maintain, a gallery of your own hurts. Now, what you are seeing and walking through is completely unique to you. For some of you, this is a fairly small room with only a few pieces hanging on display. For others of you, this room alone holds very large murals, each telling a story of a past hurt. And you can see many galleries off the main one housing more artifacts and canvases of hurt. What can I say? This is the reason this place isn't listed under the fun tour in the brochure, but it's listed under the must-see. Because it's nearly impossible to have a good relationship out there without walking through and spending some time in here. Now, admittedly, there are some people who will avoid this place at all costs. They refuse to take even one step into their hurt museum. Friends, they aren't healthy. They're in denial. Not only is their gallery as full as anyone else's, the exhibits in there are old and filling up the walls, but never dealt with. Now look around. You've probably noticed some sleeping bags and cots and bottles strewn around. That's because unlike those who refuse to ever walk in here, there are others who have made a life of camping out in here. They have hung their hurts on the wall, and they feel that they need to visit them every day or so. When the hurt collector has come along and offered to buy them, even when he offers a ridiculous price, they refuse, usually muttering something like, "I can't let this hurt go. Where would the justice be in that? They need to pay for what they did." The only problem is the people who hurt them never come through this gallery. They never see the hurt, and they don't actually even care about the hurt. The exhibit intended to pay them back and demand justice goes completely unnoticed, except for the ones staring at it. Admittedly, this is a complicated place. You'd think that just telling people to take their hurt paintings down and throw them out would solve the problem, but it only makes it worse. It certainly isn't the answer. On the other hand, holding onto a hurt painting for days or weeks or months or years and sometimes decades is also destructive. Never visiting is a recipe for disaster, and visiting too often is as well. Pretending there isn't a hurt is damaging, and becoming obsessed with the hurt, unwilling to part with it, is just as damaging. Okay, slowly turn. Take a look at the paintings and exhibits in your hurt museum. Take them in. Can you count them? How many are there? Well, as you're looking at them, you're probably wondering, well, what am I supposed to do with them anyway? Okay, slowly open your eyes. Thanks for lending me your imagination. So with that picture freshly projected in your mind, let's talk about our hurts and what to do with them. Our final yarn ingredient is this, number 10. The yarn is strong when exhibits are displayed in the Hurt Museum only for a season. Now, obviously, the Bible is full of commands and teachings on forgiveness. And just to remind you of a couple, a little bit further on from our anchor verse in Colossians 2:2 is Colossians 3:13. And Paul says, make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Jesus himself said in Mark 11:25, but when you are praying, first forgive anyone you are holding a grudge against, so that your Father in heaven will forgive your sins too. But in Matthew 18:15, Jesus tells us that there is a process to this, and he tells us how to do this. He says this, if a fellow believer hurts you, go and tell them. Work it out between the two of you. If he listens, you've made a friend. If he won't listen, take one or two others along so that the presence of witnesses will keep things honest, and try again. So while wading through the complexities of the Hurt Museum and what Jesus says, I want to suggest a strategy for dealing with the Hurt Museum. Number 1, frame the event and hang the picture. Then sit and study it. Take time to name it. Maybe even engrave a brass nameplate beside it. Betrayal, lying, broken trust. Maybe it says violation, unfaithfulness. I call this portrait abuse, or theft, or neglect, or cheating. Maybe you engrave in there deceit, or backstabbing, or call it whatever you feel best describes that dark, foreboding hurt. Name it, own it, hang it up on the wall, look at it, and feel it. Number 2, invite the offending party to visit your Hurt Museum. Now, admittedly, this isn't always possible or even advisable, but in the majority of everyday relationship hurts, and even with some severe hurts, you need to invite the person who hurt you to come and sit with you and look at the painting. Carolyn and I practice this often. She'll invite me into her Hurt Museum, and honestly, sometimes I feel really uncomfortable, and I get mad, and I get defensive, and I fail to acknowledge or own the hurt. But usually once I settle down, I sit and I can see and I can feel it, and I ask for forgiveness. And often by the end of the visit, Carolyn will invite me to come and help her take the painting down and take it out back and get rid of it. Occasionally, after I've invited her into my Hurt Museum, and we've talked about a painting and we've taken it down and gotten rid of it, occasionally we'll get into a conflict in the future, and she can tell that I've gone out to the garbage bin and I dug it out and I brought it back into the gallery and I hung it up again. It happens. It's part of what it means to fully part with a hurt. In fact, that's why Jesus said, be prepared to take it off the wall 70 times 7 times, because it has a way of coming back. So number 1, frame the event and hang the picture in your gallery. Number 2, invite the offending party to visit your Hurt Museum. If it goes well, there will just be a blank spot on the wall where the painting once hung. But what if it doesn't go well? What if that person won't come into your Hurt Museum? What if they deny hurting you? What if they won't own it? What if they refuse to acknowledge and take responsibility, let alone ask for forgiveness? Well, then we come to number 3. Sell it to the hurt collector. There's an art collector who specializes in buying the dark, menacing, sinister, ugly paintings of hurt. He paid an extraordinarily high price, but that's because he wants to see us living free from the hurt. In fact, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 says this, "All of you were once held hostage in a sinful society. Then a huge sum was paid out for you. So please don't, out of old habit, slip back into being or doing what everyone else tells you. Friends, hold the high ground with God at your side." Then later on in Galatians 3:13, Paul says this, "Yet Christ paid the full price to set us free. He absorbed it completely as he became a curse in our place." You see those dark images of hurt hanging on the walls of our hurt museum? They come to life, often at night, and they escape the painting and they seep into our hearts. Their tentacles choke our joy. Their claws etch the hurt into our memories so we replay and replay and replay them. Their slimy skin starts to suffocate our hope, and their talons cut the yarn intended to knit us together in love. In other words, you really don't want to hang on to a hurt painting any longer than you need to. And you don't have to, because Jesus has literally offered to pay the highest price to take it off your hands. As you spend the few last minutes sitting here in your hurt museum, considering what you might want to do with those hurts displayed on the walls, we're going to pump a song over the gallery sound system. And I can't think of a better song to sing over these hurts than this one.